Good afternoon. Hope you're good. I'm Jack Chew, and this is Chewing It Over, and I'm excited to get stuck into this one because I'm flying solo today, and it means that I can draw on a list of things that you've asked me to discuss with you that I never really get to when we've got guests on. So as much as I love having guests and interviews and stuff like that, and to be honest, it's my favorite thing of this show. But one of the benefits of not having, especially when we've had a run of guests, is that we can kind of draw on some of the topics that you've suggested and also some of the accusations that have been leveled at me, which is what you might have seen in the title sequence of this one, which is charges of hypocrisy that have been leveled at me and of my organizations and my projects and this show and all sorts of stuff like that, which is fun. So as per usual, my paranoia remains. Please let me know whether you can hear me or not. I know my mic discipline is a bit crap, so when I come over here, it's rubbish. So I'm going to keep that close to my face. And hopefully that then means you can hear me okay, you can see me okay, the signal looks stable. So points and prizes for the first person to tell me that everything is working all right, and I will get on with it. Because I mentioned it a bit in yesterday's show. If you haven't watched it yet, then it's well worth catching up on. Margaret Collins and Joe Turner talking about imposter syndrome feelings and why people keep themselves down and sometimes limit their potential to flourish in our industry and beyond because of this sense that they're going to get found out. And that becoming pathological instead of it being useful fuel to try and prove something to yourself and to others, it ends up being something that imposes limitations on you. Now, the more that we've talked about that, not just imposter syndrome, but shows on self-esteem, we've spoken about things on Physio Matters recently about how, or in some MSKR forums about how what we need to do to try to level up the industry. I did a show on value, didn't I, last week? There's people that have then said, well, that's a bit rich coming from you. You've, for years, until these recent outbursts, you've been part of that problem. You've been someone that has been dragging people down, making it an atmosphere that sometimes makes people feel concerned about being found out and stuff. And I thought don't want to be instinctively defensive. I think when, I'll admit that when something like that happens, I get the very real, visceral human emotion of going, no, I don't. But I think there's a kernel of truth to that. I think I can see how it would be perceived that way. I'd be very surprised. And I haven't heard from any of my nearest and dearest or people that work with me closely. They don't recognize that accusation necessarily. And they haven't necessarily seen a step difference in my position on those sorts of things recently. But those outside of my circles, network, I get it. I think that I can see how that might have come across. And I think it's a really interesting observation. And it's definitely one that I should answer to. And I need to try to make sure that I don't come across as sort of defensive or to be dismissive of that point. Now, 50% of the people that have then suggested such things in recent weeks are being arseholes, right? It's not constructive criticism. It's just that you're part of the problem, Chew, who you kidding, and stop talking. Suggestions that I'm gaslighting people into thinking that I'm not the bad guy that I actually am and that this is all one big PR exercise or whatever. Not people that I particularly listen to, certainly a hostile take and something that I don't recognize as being particularly productive and also inaccurate. I don't think it's fair. But there's 50% that are just genuinely like observing a tension between what they perceive as being where I've made a small name for myself in this industry as being someone that has been driving up clinical standards by accusation of poor practice based on my analysis of what poor and good practice would look like and things like that. And therefore, people have said that then they see that there being a tension between that guy and the guy that's trying to be what they perceive as being a bit more warm and cuddly recently, saying, pick yourself up, you're better than you think, overcome the imposter syndrome. And they see a tension between that. And I think that, especially 50% of the feedback that isn't aggro, I can see why that might have come across. I think there's something to that, and there's something for me to learn from, as well as that I'm not just saying, oh, that's all perception and no truth. I think there's something to that. I think there's definitely phases in my career, public career, where I've been aggro enough I can't be surprised that people have then recognized themselves in some of the barbs on my critique, and that might well have then induced some imposter syndrome or diminished someone's self-esteem, and that therefore when they then hear me not long after, perhaps saying stuff like I have been, they might think that that's like, what, as if there's some sort of a near schizophrenic take on things, whereby I'm actually or speaking out of both sides of my different sides of my mouth for different people or whatever. I think that's a fair point. So, how much do I think is hypocrisy then? So I want to get into that with you. Now, I ask as ever, want for you to get stuck in, and by on this, I am not necessarily this isn't one big humble brag whereby I ask my audience and you say, don't worry about it, Jack, thank you for all you're doing and stuff. Lovely as it is to hear those things, and thank you so much for that feedback that sometimes comes in. I'm not doing this show for that today, right? I'm not trying to rally the troops and say, reassure me that it's all okay, right? As nice as that might be, and feel free to say it if you really want to. But what I want to ask of you today, if you're listening live and you want to participate in this, is if we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to that argument, what do you think it might be that could have come across that way? I'm going to unpack this. I'm going to talk about it, and it might not be something that you want to get drawn into on conversation on the chats and stuff, wherever it is you're listening to this, by the way. If you're tuning in on Facebook, there's other people tuning in on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, etc. So comment where you are. But I want to ask you as to whether or not, for those that have seen it, if we give the benefit of the doubt to the fact that there is a there, because I think there is, I think there's something to be said for it. I think it's something worth answering to, that without me just defending, in a sort of a reactive way. What might it be that's sort of come across that way? And do you think there is a direct tension between my conversation about raising professional standards and holding each other accountable on a sort of self-regulatory framework for good practice and moving away from sort of dated modalities or reasoning, etc.? Do you see there being a direct tension between that and the talk about where I say that people are preying on people's low self-esteem, or the fact that we need to value ourselves better and that we need to, shake off the imposter syndrome and lift the ceiling above our ambitions? Are those compatible statements? If not, why not? If so, how can we make sure that then those that are recognizing and suggesting hypocrisy there, how might we persuade them that those things are compatible? Because I'm proud of both those bodies of work. For me, they're integrated, so I really struggle to separate them. But this charge that's been leveled has made me think more deeply about it, and so here we are talking about it and chewing it over today. So it's one of them where I'm unsure as to whether or not you guys want to get drawn in on that conversation live. But it's definitely something that not as much a request for episodes, but definitely something that you've. It's been a theme of feedback recently, and I think that's certainly interesting. Now, sorry, just turning. I thought I was getting a text through then that telling me that no one can hear me. My usual tech gremlins, but as far as I can tell, it's all working. So. What do I think? What do I think about where this is? Right. So, I want to separate things off in terms of the clinical side, right? So, is there a hypocrisy between driving for clinical excellence and therefore by definition, as soon as you define clinical excellence, you're either hinting at, or sometimes I'm declarative of, what I consider to be the opposite of that, poor practice in MSK. Is that something that you can do and pursue while still, what am I doing, waving the pen around? Is it something you can do and pursue whilst then simultaneously trying to boost the self-esteem of clinicians that are otherwise doing good, and telling people that they can, they're better than they think? I think, if I'm honest, sounds a bit aggressive, not meaning it to be, but if when I say things like put reasoning over recipes, and to always be challenging yourself in terms of what the mechanism of effect that you're implying or even declaring it is under your interventions, and if they're dated, if they aren't grounded in the realities, if they're not biologically plausible, if when I say stuff like that and I ask people to instead create a functional rehabilitation model that I think is more in keeping with the evidence base, if when I say that stuff, you hear something that truly is a confrontation, is an affront to your personhood and it affects your confidence significantly in such a way that then is something you level that at me, right? You attribute me as a person saying those things, essentially what is sharing ideas, sharing my opinions. If, despite those not being personal and me not knowing you, if you hear that and it wounds you in a meaningful way and makes you hold animus, not to my position, my opinions, but to me as a person, so that you feel got at by my general observations, which, by the way, might be wrong. I'm always wrong. That's where I think we're in a funny spot. Because if you've done that, and then the next year of me a couple of years later is saying stuff like, how do we combat imposter syndrome? And you then think back and think, well, one of the things that's added to my imposter syndrome, Stu, is the fact that you've been saying about the way that I treat knee pains nonsense. Because you've recognized and personalized yourself in the first part, and the stuff that, work that I continue to, it didn't need to be years ago. It could have been last week I've said that. And it might have made you feel that way. I could so understand why you'd think that there's hypocrisy there. In that there is, those things are incompatible with each other. And that I'm therefore speaking something I don't enact or going back on something. And I just don't think, I passionately feel that those are things that they must be compatible, because I hold both of them, and I don't think it's hypocrisy. And that's because of the way in which I think I can't help but admit that you as a recipient of that information may well have then attributed to me that to me in terms of suggested that on my character, or you've personalized my general rhetoric and it's affected you negatively, or it's been exposing. It might not even be negative, but it's just been that you feel like it was a confrontational thing for me to hear my opinion on what good and bad practice was, and what we need to, I might talk about, we need to rid the industry of those that do X. And if you heard yourself in that, I can understand why you would then personalize that. But I wasn't meaning it that way, and I don't know you. I wasn't meaning a person, and I very rarely name names. And if I do, it's mainly naming names that are attached to themes and styles of practice as examples, rather than to personalize it in any nasty way. But if you've done that, I can understand why it might come across as hypocritical, although I do disagree. Now, the thing that I've been talking about a fair bit recently with regards to esteem and value and imposters and stuff is that for me is, on a social level, one of the things that really does limit us, because it limits those that are otherwise brilliant, or even middle of the pile, right? Everything's a bell curve. So when it comes to clinical excellence, anyone that's sort of decent and upwards, imposter syndrome stops us being able to create the social changes to people's lives that I think we can in our industry and all adjacent industries, right? So the ability for us to be better at managing people's sore backs, necks, shoulders, hips, right? And the way in which we as an industry, for those that aren't necessarily clinical, to be better managers, to be better practice bosses, to be better educators, whatever it might be that you do in our industry. I see imposter syndrome and some of the esteem related or low, not valuing yourself properly, not then driving a bargain on your pay rates and your monthly, your hourly rates and in various different sectors. I see that as being a real limiting factor for what social change we can enact based on my analysis of just how much our skill set could be used right now in the world. So I stand by all that stuff, but one of the things that doesn't really apply to is the people that are on that bell curve, on the sort of low clinical quality, creating productized recipes for treating things that flies in the face of the evidence, that are using interventions and inferring a mechanism of effect on those interventions that are, for want of a better word, fraudulent, right? They're not accurate. They're not trustworthy takes on the matter. It's something that they're either ignorant to the fact that they're wrong, or they know better, but it's easier to just peddle a narrative. Those are people that aren't necessarily they're unlikely to be crippled by imposter syndrome, because they've kind of got an arrogance of they perceive themselves either to be doing the right thing, or they've justified their behavior ethically to be peddling misinformation to an otherwise vulnerable public, and they've justified it themselves. They're unlikely, in my opinion, to also then be the ones that need a pep talk from me to value themselves. If anything, they're having their value. They're part of what I argue is the problem. So for me, when the people I'm speaking to with both those things, I argue, although I'm speaking to a crowded room of whatever, hundreds of people each day that listen to this, and thousands, of course, beyond this show, is that they are different people, I guess. And so when someone might recognize themselves in both, because we're complex characters, then please do bear in mind that it may well be that you're not necessarily of one part of it. So when I'm making points in and around the sort of clinical side, what clinical excellence is, what poor practice is, you recognize yourself in that. It may well be that we met and spoke, and be that you're mistaking yourself as part of that audience. And then similarly, it might be that you are an appropriate audience for who I think probably should be given an esteem related pep talk, and should value yourself more, should charge more, should demand less of yourself, and vice versa, right? So you could have someone that then might not recognize that they're hearing the pep talk side that they think is appropriate for them, but actually they're blinkered enough to not realizing that actually the style of practice that they perpetuate is exactly what I consider to be low value care. But the problem you have is that part of the blinkered delusion that sometimes exists around those sorts of things is that they hear the pep talk and the hype and stuff and think, oh, that's nice idea. Yeah, I'll value myself more. I'll put my prices up another £100 a session. And they don't necessarily then, my rhetoric around clinical quality doesn't necessarily get to them, because they've convinced themselves, or I'm wrong, and their care delivery is actually brilliant. Now, people often say to me at that point, they're like, well, what the only thing that really makes a difference to what good or bad clinical practice is the outcomes. The patients get better. And it is something that I just can't disagree more with. And it surprises people. So if you've not heard my riffs on this is probably one where I can signpost you to many of the other 150 nearly shows of this and various physio matters things and stuff. But we're not talking about cancer. We're talking about MSK injury and pain, for which correlation and causation, very different things. So when it comes to what is quality cancer treatment, it's the things that work without major side effects, or as fewer side effects as possible, to prolong life, etc., and to decrease sickness. When it comes to MSK care, there are so many different ways that are both sensible, vaguely biologically plausible, evidence-based, and then there's right. And so the fact that you get someone better, and the fact that you get the majority of your patients better, is only part of a complex picture that I would consider to be quality practice, because of the fact that what did you do? How much did you empower that person? How likely are they to be needy of medical services ongoing? What's that done to their sense of self? How have they felt? They left your consultation block of care in a sense that they would probably be able to go and take on the world and join a gym if they want to, or start kickboxing if they want to, or just restart netball because they feel like, actually my knee's not as vulnerable as I once thought structurally or biomechanically. I don't move badly. Like, all those things matter, and they are independent of whether or not they had a good experience with you and whether or not they felt better a few sessions. And so because I say stuff like that, it means that there's more to it than just, well, my patients are happy. It's like I don't give you much credit for that, admittedly. And when I don't, that sort of rankles some people. And I think that my argument would be that if you think that just, well, my patients are happy, look at our feedback, look at our prems, or even look at our proms, look at our measurable outcomes here. It's like, yeah, but I can give you a charismatic person inferring horoscopes to be the main thing that they need to do. Come in and bring a patient in, and I'm caricaturing here, but like read their horoscope and say, right, this is what you need to do, or you need to say, I know you've got a shoulder dislocation, you've just subluxed your shoulder, but if you just, stand on one leg when you're brushing your teeth, and it'll help activate your postural muscles in your shoulder. And then time passes and they're doing a bit better, right? And time's the relevant variable for getting them better rather than standing on one leg. But then the patient feels better. The therapist feels like they've been a genius. and you've attributed the wrong thing to that recovery, tells me that the outcome measure and the experience measure aren't necessarily good evidence of good practice. You've got to get into the detail of what did they do? How biologically plausible and evidence informed is that intervention? How much did it functionally restore someone's ability? How less likely is that person to seek excessive, medical care and draw on the services, especially tax-funded services in this country? Right? That's the layers that exist around my interest in this, my project of raising standards in this industry. So when I get into that and you recognize yourself in that and you think that, well, he's talking about me there, and you might then have a knock to your self-esteem. I'm not naive enough to say that if what I've just described describes your practice, which is a bit mad because it's a caricature, I suppose admittedly I am trying to knock your self-esteem. I don't know what would your self-esteem be based on? Fraud? So when I do that, I don't see there being hypocrisy to this next bit, which is that I'm also saying that on the whole, on the mean, and especially for those that are truly brilliant thinkers in our profession, that are doing really brave things to challenge the industry and to individuals within it, and putting themselves through an academic and scientific rigor process that is really robust and impressive. They're too hard on themselves, and they need to recognize just how much they're doing, and to not be stifled by this sense of being caught out or being a fraud. I'm speaking to somewhat different corners of this industry. Now, some people suggest I overplay one or the other or both of those things. No problem. I hear that critique all the time. We can talk about it. If you want to come on the show and tell me why you think statistically I've got that wrong, why you think that there's a few bad apples, but actually not in the dozens or hundreds. If you think that the poor practice I'm describing is just something so far away from what you recognize, then please let me know. If you think that actually the industry's actually got a pathologically high self-esteem and is over arrogant of itself on the whole, and that people aren't necessarily holding themselves back when they're brilliant, let me know. So anything that, if you disagree with me, let me know. This episode I've been able to explain a little bit about why I necessarily think those two things are incompatible or hypocritical. And I don't know, I'm wrong on that as well. And you've to let me know as to whether or not you think I've justified and defended the claim well. But I just think that I wanted to do this in part because it came up yesterday. I had no guest on today, so I had an opportunity to just indulge what was over at the top of the list. I was torn between a few different things, actually. There's been some interesting crap in the media about MSK recently. And so, yeah, this was what was just top of my list when I thought about it. But I also wanted to make sure that I'm seen to demonstrate that I listen to that feedback and I reflect on it. And I also think that there's something to be said for why, there's something there. I can see why it might be. And I suppose I want to reassure those people that feel that they recognize themselves in my barbs sometimes, that it might not have been for you. Try not to take it personally, because it's certainly not personal, because I don't know you. Remember that. Be rational about it enough to say, we can't be meaning it personally because you don't know me. But then similarly, I suppose I'm admitting, try not to hear yourself in a negative critique, but then to some extent, allow yourself some of the positive, allow yourself to be lifted, as some of you have got in touch with me about and said that you're really enjoying some of that work, especially enjoying that collaborations we've been doing with Joe Turner, with Mihab. Enjoyed the show yesterday. Then those sorts of things, it's great. But I am, the thing that stops me being at odds with my own opinions is where I stop short of just being one of those sort of excessively positive, self-esteem inflating people that just hypes it and does the whole "you go girl" style sloganeering and doesn't then say, I want people that are otherwise brilliant thinkers in this space to not cap their ambitions. But I'm also not going to be one that says that everyone, regardless of your style of practice, style of personality, the way that you interact with people, the way in which you help bring others forward, I just want all of you to have a pathologically high self-esteem. Well, no thanks. I think that'd be dangerous, right? Some of you, if you recognize yourself in some of my critique of practice, that wouldn't be good. So it's a balancing act, not one that I say necessarily that I get right, and my style of delivery of that, including in this session, may well be that people are frustrated by it, and don't like me for it, and that's fine. That's your prerogative too. Don't listen, send hate mail, not bothered. But it's just that a charge of hypocrisy, I think, is a bit harsh. I don't think that's fair, and I hope those that came at me with it as just being like a dismissal and being angry about it, I didn't need to speak to them anyway. But those that wanted to raise it as a point, I think is a really interesting one for us to. Oh, sorry, I've just clicked that by accident. I'll bring that up in a second, Helen. Sorry. I'll come to your comments in a sec. I was just bringing the comments back on my eye. But I think those that heard, I forgot, I've lost my train of thought now, haven't I? Anyway, no, let's come to the comments. I've said enough, haven't I? Joe said, Dr. Pippa Grange, your results are just an outcome. They are not your worth. Yes, absolutely. I think that people need to make sure, for various reasons, I always say this to patients, especially when they've had a really random accident or whatever, it's that the fact that their productivity is not their value or their worth is super important. I think that's really helpful for people to recognize as well, is that, you know, you've got to be mindful of what you're using as a proxy of your personal value and stuff, because that's, you know, therein lies, you know, real disposition to depression if you're only thinking about your outcomes or your results. I haven't read that book or that quote or whatever, but Dr. Pippa Grange sounds interesting. I'll definitely get stuck into that if I had any time, of course. But Helen, sorry about that then. Helen, I got this interested. You said in something you said there, Jack, about self-esteem and influencing others. She then follows up with, I'm wondering if people with an outwardly high self-esteem benefit from it being knocked. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder about that. I think that certainly I do. I certainly have a on balance, and when I reflect, you know, I have something that, for various reasons, various delusions, some would say, I have a high self-esteem, lots of self-confidence, massively freakishly high extroversion, and I certainly benefit from having people around me that bring me down a peg or two on certain things, and to stop that escalating into arrogance and defail, some would say. But yeah, I do, and that doesn't mean though that you don't suffer from context specific esteem and imposter syndrome issues. You know, just because on the macro you've got that, you know, there are circumstances where, and especially for me, I just think it's like, I always, the accuracy of the charge matters to me. Like when it's unfair, when it feels unjust, that's where it bothers me, and so that's where sometimes I will defend it to high heaven. Joe Turner said, self-esteem to me is validated by external factors such as your patient got better, as opposed to self-worth, which is an intrinsic sense of your own value. I think we need to be careful which we are directing our comments at. So yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a wishy-washy liberal on this stuff, is that I just think anything I say shouldn't impact on your self-worth. Like I'm one of them that, you know, all men created equal, and that fundamentally your inherent value as a person and your self-worth is something that is not to be messed with. You know, you should have significant social value as a person, and that shouldn't necessarily be dented and is of no one else's, especially people that don't know you. They shouldn't be able to speak to that at all. It would be degrading to do that. Self-esteem, I think, is sometimes a proxy for various different things, but in this instance, it's that someone's self-esteem is their sense of self, would be another way of putting it, is something that I think will fluctuate, and that I think that, as we've talked a lot about, when self-esteem is when someone's self-esteem is lower than it should be, when you think about their objective and a rational analysis of their brilliance. But I suppose I'm admitting that that I would say that a really silly thing to do would be just to think that tide rises all ships, and that you can then just say to people, regardless of what that rational analysis of their brilliance might look like, and the way that they might have, how much work have they done to actually pursue pursue progress. How well rounded are they as a person, as a character? How much are they aspiring to fulfill the potential? If you find people that are, unfortunately, and this is the thing, it's usually more bad luck than judgment, so you want to be careful. That's why you didn't talk to someone's self-worth. But as a general rule, I don't think it'd be wise for us to then try to lift the self-esteem of those that then would end up with an imbalance between their sense of how good they are, and then they're not. It's like the X Factor contestants in the first round. Like some knobhead has told them that they're brilliant singers. How is that kind? It's humiliating. And if we do a version of that professionally, that'd be stupid. If I got hold of my next student or my next band five and said that hot take you've got on knee pain was really brilliant, I'm going to put you as a headliner on Therapy Live. And it turned out that for no fault of theirs, self-esteem falsely, and I've left them exposed. That wouldn't be good. So that's kind of what I'm meaning there. And I think maybe if I'm improperly using the term self-esteem, then I'm interested. That's definitely something I wouldn't want to misplace. But I hope that helps. I'm generally intrigued by this hypocrisy charge. I think some of it is really interesting. It's given me pause for thought. There's some bits of it, as you've heard me defend, but I'm glad I've had a chance to sort of monologue a bit on that today. Thanks so much that have commented. Sorry again that I haven't managed to get to those comments in full. It's 32 minutes, so I'm going to shut up. Tomorrow I'm with Obi Hassan for the Finance Friday. I forgot what we call it now. Finance Friday. We're going to be talking a little bit about business forecasting and practice management and stuff like that, which will be brilliant as always. So do join me and Obi for that at 12:30. Thanks so much for everyone, and I will speak to you soon. Let me try and find my little outro. See you later.